see. Karlyn, do you have to request to join? Hey everyone. We're figuring out two streams at the same time, so give us a second. We're also streaming on Circle. Okay. There's Karlyn. Oh
Yes,
my
I'm
gosh.
here. I'm sideways though. Hold on. I forget that on my iPad that my camera is. There we go.
There we go.
It's at the top. So actually, I'm just gonna have to. I wonder. No, that's gonna turn my camera around. Just gonna have to do like this. Okay. Huzzah! Nope, upside down. Okay, sorry.
No problem. Feels
We
like a
got
good
it. And like
introduction
technology.
to a Aries Libra axis full moon. Like, which way are we gonna turn?
Exactly.
Hey, Karlyn.
Hello.
Nice to see you. Hi to everyone who's joining. Welcome. Excited to be here today talking with you, Karlyn. We have been chatting for a couple months on some themes and getting ready for a deeper conversation maybe on these themes that we're going to be having next year. That's the plan. And we wanted to meet up today for this kind of full moon, growing full moon energy that really, I think, encapsulates a lot of the themes we've been talking about. So we've got a full moon coming up, and we're in Libra season, so it's a full moon in Aries. And at the full moon, the moon will be conjunct with the centaur planet Chiron in Aries, and the sun will be conjunct with Venus in Libra. Those are some basic astrological signatures that are present right now. And with that, Karlyn, what do you want to talk about today?
Yes. Sorry, y'all are gonna have to just deal with like me, my head like awkwardly floating. So I apologize. But this is just where we are, right? And so I really want to talk about the first house, seventh house axis. So for folks who maybe aren't like super duper familiar with astrology, every sign, they're like sister signs. So Aries and Libra create an axis with one another in the first and the seventh house. The first house is like the house of self, and then like the seventh house, I like to think is like the house of like the collective or the other. And so I really wanted to lean into like how does that axis create or disrupt themes of justice, because that's one of the other things that Libra also rules. And thinking about like how justice is something that is supposed to be like for the collective, but isn't always necessarily created by and or for the collective. And how does the first house of self sometimes create selfishness, right? That then impacts the ability for justice to exist in a way that is actually equitable. So those are, and then I am gonna, we can sprinkle a little bit of like, of how Chiron is impacting that, because I really love talking about Chiron, especially as it moves through Aries. Excuse me.
Do you wanna keep going with this and kind of lead us into the first question that you have or area that you want to explore after that framework?
Yeah. So I think, I've been thinking about, so I'll share a little bit too about kind of like how I got to thinking about this, and then some of the stuff that I have even been experiencing during Libra season that has really helped me kind of create this idea around this first house, seventh house axis. So I was telling Renee that I've been having a very Libra season, a very Libra season. So in addition to, just being an astrological baddie, I also recently started my own consulting company. And as I have been in negotiations with finding clients, that has one of the things, right, that Libra also rules is negotiating with folks, creating relationships. And it has been me really sitting with how do we create an equitable relationship, and like how is conversation needed for that, right? We're two people, we're two individuals, or sometimes it's me and like a company, right, coming together asking questions about what does our relationship with one another look like. And in order for that to happen in a way though that is equitable, we have to move through like what are our needs, right? Is something that one of us needs more than the other person can offer, or is it like too much for that person to offer? What are we exchanging for that need to be met? So there really is this give and take, and we have to decide with one another if something that one of us is asking for is too much, unreasonable, etc. And so that has been one way that I have been, I think, moving through, um, or how Libra has been lending its energy to me. And then I also have been in a process of also renegotiating my relationship with other people and things, right? And some of that is this person, is this thing taking too much? Am I taking too much from this relationship? Am I not giving enough in order for there to be balance, right? And I think one of the things that I do want to also name very quickly is that balance does not mean equal, but balance does mean equitable. And I think that sometimes when we're thinking about justice, that we are not thinking about, we don't think about balance or justice as being, we think of justice in the terms of equal and not equitable, right? Something does not necessarily have to be one for one in order for it to be equitable. And sometimes when we're striving for things to be equal, that's what gets us in trouble and oftentimes creates more inequity, because we're wanting for people to give or take or serve the same thing when like they can't offer the same thing to us, right? Or maybe their situation, we'll talk more when we get into a little bit, when we get into a little further into the conversation about how this is applicable, but like thinking about our prison industrial complex, right? Thinking about the carceral state, creating situations um, for what we think to be restoration oftentimes creates saying the same punishment needs to be given to everyone without creating space for what actually happened in the situation and what do people want or need as a solution for restoration, for healing, for moving forward.
Hmm. Yeah, one thing that's coming up for me as I'm listening to you is thinking about the association of Libra and Libra's ruling planet Venus with values. And what happens when values are imposed on, you know, a person or a group of people or a collective,
Mm-hmm.
um, and within, yeah, notions of justice and systems that are set up to impart justice, how deeply biased those systems are around sets of values that are held by the people who have power within those systems and who have the power to
Absolutely.
create those systems. And that this like idea of equality or parity, like same for same, so often falls short of satisfying the values of either or even both parties, because a lot of times, like, we're not really given choices that reflect the true needs or the true values that we have and what the outcomes ideally would be if they served values outside of the value system of whatever the dominant power is that set it up to begin with.
Absolutely. And I think you're touching on the relationship right between these two axes, because Aries rules the first house, and Aries wants to dominate, right? And so when we're thinking about how are these two placements in relationship with one another, how do we create balance between the desire to dominate or even the ability to do so, right? And I think that when we're talking about the justice system in our country, we don't, right? We are not thinking about that relationship at all. The people with the power are creating the dynamic, are creating the parameters, and like you said, are imposing, well, you should want this thing. You should value this way of existing. You should value this form of restoration. And then we, the collective, are then coerced into, well, yeah, I guess I do value this thing. And then, like you said, no one is really left healed, balanced, or feeling like they actually got what they needed, because there was no space for us to actually negotiate and talk through, what do I want or need in this situation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as we're talking, I'm also thinking about the placement of Libra and Aries on the zodiacal wheel in relationship to Cancer and Capricorn on the cardinal axis.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and also, just as an aside, for folks who are newer to the astrological language, there is resonance between the first and the seventh signs and the first and the seventh houses, but I do want to be careful to not conflate them because they are not the same thing. And when we're looking at a house wheel, the first and the seventh house really speak to embodiments. Your body in space, and what that body contains as an identity form, and then that body in relationship, and what happens in the space of relating and in the environment of relating. The signs Aries and Libra, I think, access more of the energetics of these places. And when we get
Mm-hmm.
into kind of like more of an esoteric or existential question of what does it mean to be a self, Aries is a place we're going to explore. And what does it mean to be in relationship or in reciprocity? Libra is a place to explore.
Yes.
But on the cardinal axis, as we move through Libra season, and with the upcoming Aries full moon and the following 2 weeks or so at the end of Libra season, there's a bunch of contact between, first the moon in the day or two after the full moon will square Pluto. But then the Sun, Venus, and Mercury will all be forming squares to Pluto and Capricorn. And Karlyn, we've talked about Pluto and Capricorn a lot, I feel like, in the tea time space at Embodied Astrology, and you and I just in conversation. And it feels like a really salient point of conversation these days, since Pluto is forming its return to its to the place that it was when the United States was incorporated with the Declaration of Independence. And this particular point that is getting activated right now by Pluto is a point that I think, when we track it through zodiacal symbolism, we can look at like the power of dominance and dominant structures imposing their will and imposing values and
Mm-hmm.
creating structure and form, that's three-dimensional, that's built with concrete and steel, that uses the labor of bodies, that takes the life of laborers and people and steals land, and uses resources to create forms that then all of our bodies, exist in and like have to exist in. And so this question of values gets like we can go so deep with it because, you know, when you're raised within a system that is built on values of enslavement or theft or something like that, you know, to survive within these systems, we're all trying to get access to capital, you know, or
Yeah,
not starve. And then what do we need to in order to do that? And then our values end up getting really mutated, I think, and corrupted sometimes or often because of the structural conditions that are imposed on our lives.
absolutely. No, I definitely agree with all of that you're saying is that, and I think that speaks to um, the way that structures are containers. And I remember that was something that you were talking about when you were talking about Capricorn and Cancer as an axis to each other. That like Capricorn creates kind of like the container for which then like Cancer can kind of like emote and experience and feel into. And I think that like that is what a structure is, right? Like if we think about a structure is something that things can then exist within, right? When a building has a structure, it's we the you know the you think of the um I think of Capricorn as like it's the wood frame that like your house is built out of, right? You don't and you don't see it, but you know it's there, right? It is the thing that's literally holding your house up, right? And then it's covered in the drywall and it has all the other stuff in it, but it is the wooden frame is the thing that, and then like the foundation. But I feel like Taurus would be more of like the foundation than that your house is like sturdily on, but like the frame of your house is what your house is built on, right? And I think that that's what you're naming is these structures that we exist in are the things that are contained are the container which within which we're allowed to exist in, and that impacts how we then are able to move and exist, and it impacts the types of things that we are even allowed to value, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I've been learning more recently about the simultaneity or the kind of co-emergence of um, whiteness as an identity and capitalism, and this uh, yeah, migration of a feudal system from Europe and then through colonial routes that fabricated scarcity, you know, and so there was
Yes.
like a wealthy elite basically that didn't want to work, wanted a life of ease and luxury, and a lot of wealth and power, and yeah, fabricated scarcity through creating wealth. And like that creation of wealth is entirely formed on theft and enslavement. And so, like, this creation of material capital or resources, you know, whether it's um, gems and jewels and silver or fossil fuels or, you know, water today or something like that. Um, that yeah, there's I think a necessary examination of um, what is actually getting valued
Mm-hmm.
within a value system or within a justice system. um, Before we started the call, uh, you know, you were talking about um, you know, certain ways that maybe the justice system has functioned or gets set up or something like that. And um yeah, I think questions that come up for me a lot have to do with um you know, when a system is set up to support and protect um perpetrators of violence,
Mm-hmm.
you know, how does that get examined? Like, how does that get brought forward when the perpetrators of violence are also in creation of the system that is doing the examination.
Absolutely. I'm gonna turn the light on really fast because I'm like, it's probably gonna start raining here soon, so I'm not getting as much natural light. I'm like, Renee and I are in the same time zone, but I see all this beautiful natural light behind Renee. It's gonna rain here soon.
Mm-hmm.
Let's turn one of these lights on really fast.
How are people who are joining us virtually doing and feeling the upcoming full moon?
I think that you're asking a really great question too about value and how it's created. Not only in the sense of how do we decide like what types of things are commodified, what types of things are compensated, but I think also when we're talking specifically around how justice is created or not, we also are talking about who gets to decide like what violence is or isn't, right? And then who then what type of violence is then punishable, right? I've been um so I also, in addition to having my own consulting company, I also work for a nonprofit in the community. Shout out to the Tucson Second Chance Community Bail Fund. And we're going to be having a teach-in next week. So I've been doing just a lot of listening around abolition work because the Bail Fund is an abolitionist organization, right? We're rooted in an abolitionist thought. And something that someone had said, and I think it was listening to like For Harriet, and they were talking about how when the protests that were happening in 2020 were happening, how there were some folks that were really upset about people responding to the death of George Floyd and all of the other deaths that have happened of Black people in like rioting, right? Folks were like, ooh, this is, we shouldn't do this. And so I think Kimberly, who's the host of For Harriet, she had posed the question. She was like, but folks are expressing their anger. And she was like, and it's interesting that when anger is expressed on behalf of Black people, it is seen as bad and violent. But then if we look at our country's history, she's like, white people have expressed their violence over less, right? In much more extreme ways, like by literally killing people, actually burning down communities. And that is not and it's not seen as reprehensible. And it was like you were saying, it's because when you are the people in power, when you're the one who is hoarding the ability for us to actually negotiate and talk about what our needs are, you get to dictate whose even anger is valid and then also punishable, right? So I had never really, I thought about that, like, it kind of in passing, but when she framed it that way, I was like, yeah, that is actually something that happens. And I think that is, that had really helped flesh out the idea of how I was looking at Libra and Mars as an axis in relationship to one another, is like, how does power create imbalance? How does looking at one person's or one group's needs and being hyper focused on that create imbalance? And like, what does that imbalance then also create like for the rest of us, right? And how are we then forced to move through that imbalance, right? When sometimes we may not even see it as an imbalance, right? Because we just have so normalized that this is just how it is. This is just what we do. We don't even then have language sometimes to talk about how this doesn't actually feel good, right? This
Mm-hmm.
I actually don't like this. I actually don't think that this is what we should be doing. I'm not sure that I agree um, with us centering, the needs of a very select group of people and then ignoring the needs of others, right? So yeah, that really helped kind of ground this idea of me really seeing that there is a relationship here, right, between these two things. Like, how do we sit with and move through and try to create the language about how this um how this relationship between these two axis points also is very delicate, right? Because sometimes I feel like sometimes the collective need and or desire can overlap with the self, with the group, the selected folks that we're maybe focusing on. And like, that can be, just because they overlap though doesn't mean that that is what we need to be doing. And how do we
Mm.
move through the feelings may be the same, but the action might not be what is necessary. And how do we pause and say, I agree with your and I's feelings align with each other, but what I think we need to do to move forward is where the point of divergence may come, and like, that's okay, and we can hold space for that, because what is going to be good for all of us, including you, in the long run. And it might not be this thing that's going to feel good to you right now, but it will be a thing that is better for all of us later.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder how you're thinking about this, particularly with Chiron transiting Aries. I feel like we've we've talked about Chiron and Aries a couple of times, and it's such a rich symbol of thinking about what you're bringing up because,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I mean, with Chiron's symbolism or myth, I feel like there's a lot of um, textures arising that have to do with the ways that we can't actually um, heal ourselves of the wounds imposed by sense of self, and that in order to become healed, it's like there needs to be a surrender of the personal in a lot of ways, and that especially with Chiron and Aries, this kind of archetypal energy of a wounded healer or a healing journey coming into the space of the self feels like it evokes a lot of the rifts and the cracks in our psyches that have emerged within the takeover of collective consciousness, that has come up through the last 500 or so years, at least with the colonial history, but longer than that in terms of religious supremacy or gender supremacy, and modes of thought that really separate self and other, and that objectify bodies and cast, other bodies, other beings into, some kind of form that is there, for my taking, for my satisfaction, for my exploitation or extraction. And that way of thinking or that way of feeling, again, is such a deep mutation of consciousness, and a real rupture of any kind of notion of reciprocity, because as soon as we're objectifying a human being, but also, a tree or a mountain or a lake, and thinking about, what do I need in this relationship, and like, what can I have and what can I take, or even what can I give,
Mm-hmm.
but not from a place of actual attunement or feeling ourselves as completely, affecting one another and emerging from the same stuff, and um, constantly in relationship. And it's like the choices that we make, we might not know what the outcome of the choices are going to be in our lifetimes or anytime immediately, but they will never be as simple as like a materialist concern, of like, oh, I want this from that person, so I'm gonna like do this thing in order to get it. It's like, yeah, if we're making that choice from a self-centered place or taking action from those materialistic places, um, from the beginning, we're doomed. You know, the relationship is never there. And jumping back to Venus, you know, and Venus's symbol, and Venus being a symbol of sweetness, you know, and honey, and it's like the good stuff in life, um, completely gets, yeah, annihilated by materialism and objectifying of life forms. It's like that sweetness then doesn't get to exist, and what comes in is consumption, you know, or a kind of like sensory consumptive satisfaction, but it's so temporary.
Mm-hmm.
um yeah, Karlyn, how do you think about Chiron and Aries? I love it when you talk about that
Yes.
placement.
So much was coming through when you were talking about. So the way that I like to think about Chiron and Aries is, I feel like Chiron and Aries is like Chiron and Aries is like, here are all the things that you need to heal right now. 911 emergency, right? It's truly exposing all of the things, and doing so with an urgency, right? Because I think of, you know, Aries is ruled by Mars. I think Aries is a fire sign, right? And fire is like passionate, it's sparking, it's like, yes, we need to do this right now. And so I think that that is the piece where a lot of folks are talking about kind of this like constant feel of overwhelm. I think that that is where the constant feel of overwhelm is that Chiron and Aries is like, you can't do this tomorrow, right? It needs to be addressed right now, because these are the things that you have like been ignoring. You haven't been looking at this stuff, and in order for you to kickstart the healing, in order for you to get to the place where you want to be, in order for you to um, I also think, you know, be the best versions of yourself that you want, you have to do this right now. You have to, it needs to be addressed today, right? I also think about when you were talking through what you were talking through, I was thinking about how I think that the other piece that's really important of Chiron being in Aries too is that it is saying, and we need to heal ourselves, right? In order for us to be able to heal the collective, we have to start with ourselves, and we also have to, what you were saying too, is recognize what the limitations are for us to heal on our own, right? And I think that that is what like Chiron even represents as a symbol. Chiron was already great in his ability, but then was forced, right, to learn from others, which then made his ability as a healer expand. So I think that that's like also this important relationship too, is that yes, you know, we need to heal ourselves. And also, we can only do so much healing on our own, because there are things that other people have that we don't, or maybe we have the same thing, but maybe you're better at it, right? So, like for example, you and I are both students of astrology, and I'm learning from you because you possess wisdom that I do not, right? And I could, you know, learn astrology by myself in my house and read, and never talk to anyone else about it, but then I would not grow also as an astrologer, right? I would also not grow as a practitioner. And I think that that is also an important aspect of Chiron being in Aries right now too, is asking us to sit with what does it mean for us to be able to recognize when we have done all that we are able to alone, and then how do we then go out in community and ask for help and be supported and then do healing with and for the collective, right? um which can be like, that can be challenging, especially in our hyper individualistic society, where we're told you should do everything by yourself, because it's you versus everyone else, right? um And I think that maybe is the other thing that's also being highlighted for us too, is how like that is not sustainable. We
Mm.
can't sustain ourselves, right? Like alone, or for not long term. It's not possible long term. You can do it for a little bit, but like in the long run, you'll burn out.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. It's interesting to hear you talk about Chiron and Aries and urgency and like urgency around healing. Um, in part because Chiron's orbit is elliptical and very irregular, and so it spends the longest time in Aries out of any other signs. I think it spends about 9 months in Libra, and it spends um, almost 9 years in Aries. Um, and I'm thinking about, Chiron and Aries generational signatures. The last time Chiron was in Aries was during the civil rights movement and moment in the 1960s and 70s. Um, and I feel like Chiron and Aries as a symbol, like, can come through, as individuals really taking a stand for the collective and like for Libran values, but through a very like martial or Mars orientation way, like out in the streets and activating and agitating and speaking out and taking a stand, and this kind of you know energy that I think individuals can infuse into the collective. And
Mm-hmm.
then I also think about another side of Chiron and Aries, which is really seeing the destruction of the individual by a state of reality that separates the individual. And I mean, I think a lot of the work that transformative justice is doing and trying to do, of looking at people who are perpetuating violence or causing harm, but understanding that the harm is a collective harm that is being embodied in a person within conditions that
Yes.
are like creating the circumstance for a person to act in harmful ways. And that, in order for an individual to heal, like the collective and the community has to be engaged in the process of healing. And to
Yes.
isolate that individual and label them as a problem or something like that not only isn't doing anything for the individual, but it's doing nothing for the community. It's not looking at the systemic origin of that harm.
Absolutely.
um, but what it is doing, to go back to this square situation to Pluto and Capricorn, is building um, a system that is really set up on binary kinds of ideas of like self and other, and particularly like when what and who is considered a self, like who gets to be a self,
Yes.
who gets to be a human, right, is uh, going to be a figure that embodies again the values of the dominant system. And then who is less than human
Yes.
are all of the people and all of the beings that somehow threaten um the individual's wealth or comfort or happiness or something like that. And so then
Sense of self, right?
that's it, yeah. um but then we get to have this creation of like a carceral system, or this separation of multiple bodies that don't get to enjoy status of a protected self and an honored self or a respected self who's worthy of healing, who's worthy of community care, but is going to be locked up and or put away or vilified in some way. But especially in regards to the carceral system and what you're working on, um, what we have is a modern formation of an enslaved workforce, and almost 1 million people who are working, long hours in incredibly grueling conditions and really hard work, not being paid and producing profit, lots of profit for a wealthy elite.
Yes. And also doing so in various ways, right? Like besides the the piece of like the labor that folks are doing to create wealth, right? So like aside from imprisoned folks create or incarcerated people like literally creating goods, right? So like literally creating tangible goods for no wages for corporations. Also the various ways that folks are then able to create industries within prisons, right? So shout out to Tiara for teaching me about these things. Tiara is the executive director of the Tucson Second Chance Community Bail Fund. You know, she talks about all the time about how like if you want to call someone who's incarcerated, there's a particular way that you have to do it.
Right.
So then there is an industry that, right, there are people who are capitalizing off of your ability to even want to be in contact with your loved ones. There are contracts sometimes that states have with prisons about giving money. If we build this prison, we want it to be at this capacity, and then even if it is, we're going to get this money. Food services, you know, folks are getting contracts for food services to feed incarcerated folks, right? So there's all of these other ways that people are making money off of prisons that isn't just off of the labor that incarcerated folks are being coerced into performing. They're also creating industries within these places. Oh, you want to talk to your loved one? These folks have to eat. These people have to wear a particular, you know, uniform, right? There's all of these other ways that folks are then trying to figure out ways to commodify incarcerating people. I think that you really touch on a really great thing too about how the self, you had talked about this when I think we were in Aries season. You had done it for, I think it was either the workshop or the tea time. We were exploring like how do we create the self, right? How do we separate ourselves from others and understand, okay, I'm Karlyn. What makes me Karlyn is this. But what happens when you live in a society that is fixated on the creation of self, that is fixated on separating yourself from other people? And how does that, you were talking about the symbolism of Aries having the sword wants to cut away. What happens when we start cutting away at ourselves? Because in the journey of trying to be so individualistic, you know, that we are now wounding ourselves in the process of trying to create ourselves and are in the process of trying to separate ourselves from those people over there. And I also think that that is actually, you provided me the language to actually be able to put this thing together of when I was thinking about the carceral state and how it is able to be created and to function, and how that ties into whiteness and white supremacy. White people have done all kinds of horrific things as a way to say, we are not like those people, right? They have done all kinds of cutting away of their humanity, of cutting away from themselves, cutting themselves away from a collective and a community in a actual meaningful way, through the construction of the identity of whiteness, right? And we then see how the carceral state plays a role in that. If we're thinking about what you were saying too about how binaries are created, what's something that immediately, and you know, folks who are sitting with us joining in too, what's something that you immediately think of when you think about incarcerated people and how we justify incarcerating people? Those people are bad.
Right. And I
Those
think
are evil. Those people are in jail, right? And then now when we're thinking about how even incarceration is racialized, right? It's racialized. There's ways that it has been gendered in the past. There's ways that it has been tied to people's sexual orientation. It is those people, right? Those people over there who are different from me are doing something wrong. They're doing something that makes them evil. They're doing something that makes them less human. They're doing something that makes them undesirable. They're doing something that makes them wrong. And we want to separate ourselves, we want to, from them, right? From even being able to identify with them. And we want them away from our society because we don't want them infecting the collective with their immorality, with their badness, with their evilness, right? And then and we can see the lengths that we go through to create conditions, to create talking points and rhetoric and ideas, and then reinforce those ideas to justify pulling people out of their communities and vilifying entire groups of people as an other, and collectively, right? And saying those people over there are different from me and they're bad. And that's why it's okay for us to do this. Or even saying this is why we have to do this. We have to separate ourselves from those people, because if we don't, they're going to destroy this, they're going to destroy society, and then we'll all be evil, right? And so it is the hyperfixation on not wanting to see people, like you said, as people, not being able to see like the humanity in others, commodifying folks, and really like having this warped sense of self, and not seeing that when we go to these lengths to lock people away and put them in horrific conditions and justify that like that hurts all of us. We're not just harming those people. It harms the collective. It makes our society sick. It teaches all of us to detach from pieces of ourselves, to then have to live with the fact that we exist in a society that throws people away and invest a fuck ton of money in doing so. And then it's just like, this is fine.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I'm listening to you, I'm like, I'm getting struck by this co-emergence of an individualist society, right? And like this idea of, self as dominant, and this myth of manifest destiny that's wrapped up in colonialism, and the construction of self that needed to happen within the church, and the kind of like moral mind state of colonizers, and
Mm-hmm.
the royalty or families that were funding these ventures at that time, that separated self from others, and separated like the idea of basically like a wealthy Christian European male as an example of what is human, and then everything
Mm-hmm.
else, and it's like, what is human is not nature, right? Like that there was this original kind of severing from nature, which allows for abuse of the earth, and extraction of resources beyond what is simply needed in order to create wealth. But then what is feminine, and certainly what is indigenous, also gets wrapped up into nature, right? And
Yeah.
like what certain bodies get to commodify. And so simultaneous as like the birth of this notion of a kind of like supremacist individual mind is
Mm-hmm.
also the birth of a way of being that is homogenizing, and
Yes.
like this like instinct to be in the us category, right? Because in the us category, if we're not in the them category, then there's some safety here.
Yes.
And that creation of artificial scarcity and the foundation of capitalism, and the creation of whiteness that forced European people who had their own ethnic identities to become white, was uh, it was a horrible barter. It was like a horrible trade of like, you get to give up your ethnic identity, your difference, your diversity, and join this homogenous group. And then within this homogenous group, you can have some kind of access or proximity to this idea of power, which then gets to instill in you an idea of like a supremacist individual that then you can objectify and materialize and take what you want and have access to some kind of like power in relationship or power over.
Yes.
You know, when it's like biodiversity is the abundance of the planet, and every single life form is so important when it
Yes.
comes to every single life form surviving and thriving. And, you know, I feel like all of our ancestors somewhere in their indigenous past knew that, but the, yeah, mutation of consciousness has completely annihilated, you know, this way of being that is reciprocity and that is relationality. And in the Aries Libra axis and in the axis of 1-7 in the chart wheel, you know, I'm thinking about a lot of the questions that come up, you know, in astrology that feel like they just lead to deeper and deeper questions, because even within the questions that might come up, like you were talking about engaging potential clients and like, you know, how do you negotiate contracts with people that you're going to work with, you know, and certainly in this axis, a lot of things that come up have to do with romance and partnership and like, how are we going to be in relationship? But the conditions for all of us to be in relationship, whether they're work relationships or friendships or romantic relationships, you know, a lot of them are just completely founded within a capitalist paradigm and within a supremacist paradigm. And so it's hard to think in ways that are actually both mutual and attuned and empathic while
Yes.
also very self-loving, you know, because
Yes.
it's like what we're getting at is, in order for all of us to be healthy, we have to all be cared for. I have
Yes.
to really love myself in order to actually love you. But then under the auspices of, you know, the current condition of consciousness and modernity or whatever, um, that the relationships that we have just get completely flattened into objectified materialist kind of exchange spaces where it's like, well, what am I getting and what am I trying to get and da da da, and like,
Mm-hmm.
you know, we're all caught up in negotiating on a somewhat surface level a lot of the time, when I think you know, really a lot of the questions that we're often asking need to just go so much deeper. It's like so many people in their romantic relationships and partnerships are trying to meet the needs of a fucking village. You know, it's like, I need this, I need that, I need this kind of support, I need that kind of attention, da da da. And it's like,
And that's you're touching on something that I think is so important, right? Especially when we're exploring like this axis specifically, is like, how are we in relationship with one another in ways that, like you said, are mutual. Again, I'm going to go back to that, are equitable, that are balanced. And especially when, you know, you said something that really, that I was like, all of the thoughts, the galaxy brain. So I think the thing that's really interesting about how the way that like our hyper individualistic society functions is that part of the imbalance requires for the folks with power to ignore the to actually to um delude themselves into thinking that they are not in relationship with other people, that the relationships that they have with other people, that the labor that those other folks are doing actually doesn't matter, when that is like, when it's simply not true, right?
mm-hmm.
Rich people want for us to think about, you know, you hear it all the time when, you know, fucking super ultra rich people are like, I have all of these things because I'm just really smart. No, you have all of these things because you have stolen labor from people. You have created and defined terms and conditions that have, you know, flattened and devalued the things that folks are doing, that are literally giving you money and telling yourself that then these folks, their labor is not valuable. But then if their labor wasn't valuable, then have so much value from the work that they are doing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's like the perversion, right, of how how imbalanced relationships are created, is when one party is telling themselves that the things that this other person are doing doesn't matter. And it's like, if it didn't matter, then you wouldn't need my labor. You would not continue to take my labor if it wasn't fulfilling something for you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's the part that is really challenging about when we're trying to recalibrate things, is one, the folks who are being disempowered in that situation to really understand the value that they bring to relationships, right? Um, talking of, and then understanding that, then and then trying to go through the reconciliation process of not wanting to then become dominating in that situation, right? And then doing things that then also replicate harm, like, well, I'm just going to withhold, which can be like, granted, withholding can be, I'm thinking about like strikes, right? When laborers are like, we're gonna withhold our labor until the conditions are better, and so we get compensated properly, until we are recognized for the power that we actually do possess in this relationship, to actually then talk about how we are actually in relationship with one another, and these pretend in between spaces that you have created, and this separation is fake. That's something, there's actually something that is in esoteric. Um, People who are spiritual practitioners say this all the time. They're like, separation is an illusion. It is not, it doesn't exist. We are not actually separated from one another, because we are all interconnected with each other. We are connected, to the plants and the trees and to one another. And the idea that we exist apart from one another is an illusion. They're like, it is an ego-based illusion that your spiritual self knows not to be true. And
Right.
that
But
that is true. Oh, sorry, yeah, go ahead.
well, just to jump back and tie into what you were saying before, like uh, equity is not equality,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and certainly not parity or sameness. I think that notion, especially within spiritual communities, can get really bypassy or gaslighty really quickly, you know, because yes, separation is an illusion, and you and I are also different.
Yes.
And in our, in our shared uh, and completely interpermeating existence, you know, of being part of the same stuff of life, we're
Yeah.
totally affecting each other's experience, but we have
Yeah.
responsibility to each other. We have accountability to each other because we're having different experiences of the same thing, which is life.
Yes. And I think that when folks say that separation is an illusion, they mean that, like, because there's this idea that, like, I think what they're getting at is that, like, there are people who live their lives, right, thinking about like how capitalism is functioning currently and literally destroying the planet. Folks are deluding themselves into thinking, my choice as an ultra rich person doesn't have an impact on folks over there, right? That's what they're talking about, is that, like, there's an illusion of, I'm not doing it. Me wanting to extract labor from people doesn't mean that you have to do it. And it doesn't have any lasting impact on others. And it's like, that's not true, right?
Right.
And I think that understanding that we are not separate from one another then lends our ability to then lean into what you just named of, because we are not separate from one another, how do we then talk about what our responsibilities to one another, to each other are, that allow for us to honor our experiences that we're having as individuals, because we are experiencing and living life differently, but then understanding that some of our decisions may negatively impact people, like being overly invested in prison, right? Like, that
Mm-hmm.
is a negative. And the way that I was thinking about that too was like, people want to feel safe, and people's feeling and wanting to feel safe is valid. But what happens when your feeling of safety is rooted in hypotheticals and it's rooted in creating like far reaching generational communal harm to other people. Your feeling of safety is valid, but, or not but, and also you wanting to feel safe in this particular way is harmful to other people. And we have to have like and thinking that, well, me wanting to feel safe and being super invested in the police doesn't mean anything to you. And it's like, that's not true, because there are material consequences for this idea that you have when you are separating your idea of safety from how it impacts other people.
Mm-hmm.
And so what you're saying is like, how do we understand that like what safety means for you and what safety means for me may be different because of our experiences. So then how do we have a conversation about what our responsibility is to honoring those experiences while also recognizing that like we may be inadvertently creating harm by thinking that because our experiences are different and because we are understanding and living separately from one another, that it doesn't matter.
I mean, I guess for me, it would more be the need to look at the concept of safety
Mm-hmm.
first, and what does it mean for any of us to want or to be able to access safety in a world that is so extremely unsafe for so many people and for so many life forms. And, if I'm in a position where I can access safety um, within this world, that means that I'm in a position to get away from and exclude and hold myself in some kind of space outside of a reality that is true for, over 50% of the planet, and certainly a larger percentage than that if it comes to the more than human realms.
Yes.
Um, so, yeah, I think, it's like, yes, the individual experience is a place where we begin, and it's like we meet the world through our bodies, and in our lives we each have different conditions, and we have to reckon and contend and learn within those conditions. But the the context and the conditions are creating our individual bodies, and we can't see ourselves outside of them.
Yes.
um I'm just noticing that we're coming up on time for the hour
Yeah.
that we have for our talk, and so I am hoping that we could end just with like a little bit of a summary of the full moon that's coming up. And maybe, Karlyn, you have a prompt for people to be thinking about over the next 2 days. So the full moon is on Sunday. It perfects on Sunday, but we're very much within the full moon vibes as of tomorrow, when the moon enters Aries, through Saturday, through Sunday, and into Monday. As I mentioned a while ago, this is a full moon right at the middle of Aries, and it's conjunct with the centaur planet Chiron. And the moon is opposing the sun. The sun is in Libra, and it's very close to Venus. And Venus will actually form its cazimi with the sun on the last day of Libra season on October 22nd. And so we're really in an interesting moment when it comes to Libra placements in our chart, Libra concepts of equity and relationship and justice and harmony and love, and what's pleasant and beautiful and like sweet in life. Because the cazimi is a time when it's said that Venus enters the heart of the sun. And so the love nature, the relational nature, for each of us as individuals and people, is getting infused with consciousness right now. And so what we're paying attention to relationally provides an incredible place of seeding opportunity and initiating new growth. The moon in its conjunction to Chiron in opposition to Venus and the sun also, I think, really offers a lot of insight and awakening into our personal journeys of healing and the issues that come up in the spaces between self and other, because we're all wrestling with them within these larger conditions. And the ways that, I was thinking about how you know, all the ways that I naturally want to love people get blocked by the fact that we are all so stressed out about surviving and making enough money and that we have to work, you know, and the ways that I naturally want to love people and come into community are confined within these conditions. And in the lifetime that I'm here to live, you know, like, how do I want to meet those conditions? You know, because of course I can complain about it and, you know, rant and rave and like bitch about it. But also, you know, as individuals, we do affect one another. We do participate with community and with community consciousness. And this full moon is also speaking to that. It's forming a grand trine in the air element with Saturn and Vesta in Aquarius and with Mars in Gemini. Mars is about to station retrograde. So there's a lot of space for changing ideas, for shifting conversations, and infusing our relationships with, I think, questions, you know, and curiosities and possibilities or invitations for ways of being that could bring our relationships and therefore our individual experiences into new places. So, Karlyn, do you have any prompts or ideas for people to be meditating with over the next couple of days of the full moon?
Yes, I do. When you were sharing about that the full moon is going to be conjunct with Chiron, and then Venus is going to be hanging out somewhere over there too. I think the thing that I want for folks to sit with is, you know, during this full moon in Aries, right? The placement of self is with the, you know, since it's going to be infused with Chiron's energy, is like, what are the ways that your wounding around yourself keeps you from being able to be in community fully, right? So like you kind of created a container for us to think about that in, right? When we're thinking about how we live in this capitalistic, individualistic society where we're constantly surviving, it is scary for us to be in relationship because it's like, well, this person might take something from me and then I won't be left with anything or won't be left with enough. So I'm wondering if folks can like sit with like, what are those places where you are scared to be in community because of scarcity or because of the things that you have experienced that have told you that community is bad or harmful, or that people will take things from you and you won't be able to get them back, right? And I want for folks to kind of sit with that, you know, with this full moon prompt. And then you mentioned that Mars is going into retrograde. I think it goes into retrograde. I think it's at the end of the month, right?
Yeah, October
So
30th.
like that may, who knows, that might be a theme that comes up, is like, how are you using your passion? How are you directing your energy? Where are you directing your energy? So maybe sit with that, like even through like the Mars retrograde. How are you thinking about and moving through the places that you channel your passion or even your anger? And like, what is your anger trying to tell you, right? Because when I was in therapy, one of the things that so my Mars is in Aries, for folks. And one of the things that my therapist had identified was like, you say that you're angry about a lot of things, but when I listen to you, I hear so much more beneath your anger. There's disappointment, there's sadness, there's hurt, there's grief, there's all of this other stuff that like you understand that manifests in your body as anger, but like there's actually this robust things that you're feeling like right beneath that, but anger is the thing that you know how to articulate. So what are the things that are lying, what wounding do you have around the need to preserve self that then keeps you from being fully in community? And like, ask Venus to help you, you know, be a solve and some sweetness for leaning into and tending to those spots of tenderness.
Mm, I love that. And yeah, I just want to echo the phrase radical tenderness and radical vulnerability, because I feel like what you're bringing in is deeply subversive to the, status quo and system of dominance and supremacist power, um, because it dissolves that false binary and false separation. And when we can really, land in our hearts and bodies as we communicate. And I think this is a potential of Venus's cazimi with the sun and Mercury coming back into Libra as well. That the willingness to have courageous conversations where we're speaking to the truth of our own experience, but from a place of, self-reflection, and like kind of not orienting towards maybe emotions that are stronger, faster on the surface, but we've taken the time to introspect. Really invites like a rewriting and reworking of the relational contracts.
Yes.
Karlyn, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. This was such a wonderful conversation. Thank you to everyone who is here live and everyone in the future who will watch this. I hope that you feel restored. I hope you walk away with some beautiful reflections. Yes.
Also, I want to let folks know that Karlyn and I are going to be hosting a virtual care space on Election Day. Is that November 6th? Is that
November the
day?
8th. It's going to be Tuesday, November the 8th. I'm going to have my tarot cards. It's going to be a good time. We're just going to hold wonderful space for folks to, we're just going to hold space for folks to be able to like process what's going on. I'm going to do a collective reading and see what the energies are that day, and then maybe get some insight onto like what we can maybe lean into moving forward. Super excited about that.
Cool. So we'll share more information about that as the day comes nearer. And for folks who are part of the Embodied Astrology community space, we'll see you at tea time on Sunday. I think Karlyn said you're going to be there.
Yes, I will be
at Libra season.
Sunday. Super excited.
Cool. All right. Well, full moon love to you. Wishing you a really rich and vital, energizing, and also deeply restorative next couple of days. I hope the full moon just wraps you up with all kinds of goodness and love.
Thank you. Thank you. The same. Yes. Have a great rest of your day or night whenever you are seeing this, folks. And
Bye for now.
Bye.